Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. Once again, we're in the press bar in Albion Street just to prove that indeed the licensing hours are upon us. This is one of the best pints of Guinness to be had in Glasgow, certainly one of the top 10 in pubs. It's my tipple of choice. The press bar, very much an old newspaper man's bar. I've spent many an evening in here, most of which I can't remember. It's a 35 ml shop, so if you like your shots, do come. Bar staff are super friendly and the music's great in the evening. Great cross-section of people in Glasgow come into this pub, so thank you very much to the press bar for hosting us once again. Alex, I see that you have a pint of what I would refer to as cooking lager.
It's the people's lager, Bernard, befitting my status as salt of the earth Scotsman, you know. Yes, a pint of Tennent's that has come all the way from the Well Park Brewery, I hope.
less than a mile from here.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't get fresher than this. No, it's lovely to be back in the press bar, as you say, one of the great journalistic watering holes of in Scotland. Welcome to the show, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being with us. This is another show where we're going to consider some of the questions and observations that you have sent in to us. We're always very grateful for those and love to hear what you're interested in, hear your questions. If you'd like to submit notions for future shows, you can get in touch by email at ponsonbymassey@gmail.com or on Twitter, now known as X. The handle there is also at ponsonbymassey. And do give us a follow there and keep in touch that way. As always, the show is available on all podcast platforms. If you're enjoying the show, we would be very keen if you would leave a review, preferably a positive one, on Apple or Spotify or wherever you happen to.
They're not all positive, you know.
No. But you know, our listeners are a decent bunch. I think they
mostly they are. They absolutely are.
I mean, even some of the elected ones.
yes, indeed.
But we should probably move on. So here's a question that in some ways goes back to some of the things we were talking about on the last episode when we were discussing the Tory leadership contests north and south of the border. Here's a question from Lee Carney. So Bernard, he wonders, do you think the Tories have it within them to fight what he calls their hard right? Or will the One Nation Tories continue with their weakness and refusal to fight that has defined them for the last decade?
It's a great question because it goes to the ideological fault line within the Conservatives. Are you the One Nation tradition, or are you going to be overly influenced by the reform agenda? I suspect that whoever goes into the ballot of Conservative Party members, a candidate of the right will emerge. That's just my hunch, and as we've discussed many times before, there may well be sound strategic reasons why the Conservatives should move to the right to deal with the reform threat in the short term, but there's a world of difference between strategic placement and what is in your electoral interests. And I think the problem that the Tories will have is that Labour will almost certainly govern from the centre ground, and if they can keep the show on the road economically, by the time the next election comes, Labour will be able to portray the Conservatives as a party of the hard right. And as every psephologist worth their salt will tell you, if you fight your campaign too far from the right or too far from the left, therein lies electoral catastrophe. Will they take on the hard right? I suspect not. And I think some people who naturally gravitate towards the left, like Tom Tugendhat, talking in terms of I stand ready to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights, already reform are setting the tone and to some extent the content of the Conservative Party leadership contest. So to answer the question directly, I think nobody will take on the Conservative right in the circumstances of the leadership contest.
I think that's probably true, because in the end, the next leader of the UK party, and indeed the next leader of the North British branch, is going to be chosen by the members. And the members have one set of views that, although they're not as monochrome, if you like, as some of the caricatures would have us believe, not every Tory member is a lapsed Reform member. The Conservative Party is slightly broader than stereotypes of it would lead one to believe, but it is still clearly the case that it is old and grey, and not necessarily in sympathy with modern metropolitan liberal Britain. And one of the problems I think the Conservative Party has is that in both England and Scotland, it has retreated to the shires. The Conservative Party has a negligible presence in terms of electoral success in London, although there are still plenty of people who vote Conservative in London, at least in mayoral elections. That doesn't translate into winning parliamentary seats. And if you look at the Tories in Birmingham, in Manchester, in other English cities, as well as obviously Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee. Here, again, the urban metropolitan Conservative Party is no longer viable as an election-winning force, and that is if you cede that amount of territory to the Labour Party or to the Lib Dems or to the SNP, then you have to win absolutely everywhere else. You have to win all the suburban seats. You have to win all the semi-rural seats, all the market town seats, to have a chance of returning to power in the House of Commons.
I think the problem with that is that, as we witnessed, the Liberal Democrats were pretty buoyant. I'm not sure a lot of people who are instinctively conservative actually realise that the Liberal Democrats are a party of the centre-left. It's just that these people can't bring themselves to vote Labour. But in any case, there are now quite a number of Liberal Democrats who now have to be taken out. In the North British branches, as you put it, Alex, there's an even bigger problem, which has been a systemic one of decline over a long number of years. Edinburgh used to be at one point the most conservative city in Britain. It no longer is. Even in the city where we're doing this podcast today, we are around the corner from the city chambers in Glasgow, and people would simply be astonished to learn that in 1977, between 1977 and 80, the Conservatives were running Glasgow District Council, as then was, in coalition, it has to be said, by the SNP, Conservative SNP coalition from 77 to 80. And some of the constituencies in the West, the old Eastwood/East Renfrewshire constituency, a little bit of Scotland that was forever Surrey, a little bit of Scotland that was forever blue, again represented in the main over the last 20, 25 years by politicians of the centre-left. So they not only have a problem in England, they have a more severe problem in Scotland. And really, you have to say that the Tories have to go back to the drawing board and ask themselves a simple question. What are we for? Scottish politics is absolutely entrenched in terms of support for parties of the centre-left. It's always struck me during the entire devolved era that the Conservatives are normally a party of the centre-right, but they are incapable of defining what that means. And, it'll be interesting to see if Murdo Fraser, if he does become the Scottish Conservatives' new leader, are they really going to engineer a serious debate about the nature of the state, the size of the state, cutting taxes? And because at the moment they seem to be, to me, to be stuck as part of the Scottish Parliament consensus. They do not seem to appear to operate out with it.
Well, yeah, that's one of the problems, isn't there? That, if you're a party that aspires to be in government, you have to follow the centre ground. You have to, move towards where the great mass of voters is. But the great mass of voters in Scotland is not where the Conservative Party is. And so then the question becomes, well, OK, we are not going to be in government. So where do we focus our attention? Do we try and lift ourselves from 14 to 20% in the polls? Or do we try and win the battle of ideas? Do we start talking about things that may not have an immediate political payoff, but that 5-10 years down the line become the new battlegrounds of Scottish politics? Do we start proposing ideas on education or reform of the health service or other public services, reform of how we go about the business of government in Scotland, that one day will be an influential discussion. That is the one of the questions for the Conservative Party. When you're talking about the past history of Glasgow City Council, I think that's very interesting, the idea of an SNP-Tory coalition back in the late 70s. Because it's also, I would suggest to you, that if you take the constitutional question out of Scottish politics, which is now, of course, impossible to do, but just as a hypothetical matter, there is a sense, isn't there, in which the natural fault lines in a devolved parliament elected by proportional representation are SNP and Tory on one side and Labour and Liberal Democrat on the other side. Now that requires, as I say, the national question to have been solved, but there is a right-wing constituent to the SNP that believes in economic growth, that believes in self-reliance and up by your bootstraps kind of conservative thinking, and that marries quite well with the Tories. As I say, this is somewhat fantasy politics because one has to take the national question out of things, but were that the case...
Posters of Alex Massey, even as we speak, are going on to dartboards, and members of the SNP are all going to start playing a game of darts with it. I can hear the squeals in nationalist circles about that last observation. I would tend to put it like this. How many people in Scotland essentially believe in low taxes rather than the taxes that we have at the moment? How many people in Scotland believe in a smaller state rather than the size of the state that we have at the moment? How many people in Scotland believe that we should be working hand in glove with business in order to get economic growth? How many people in Scotland believe that the politics of Scotland is too interventionist, too corporatist, doesn't rely enough on individuals taking personal responsibility? How many people in Scotland think that we have a welfare state which is not an enabler back to work, but which is simply an incitement for people to have welfare as a lifestyle choice? Now, if I was answering all of those questions, I would say that the number of people in Scotland who believe in all of those things is a lot higher than 14%, much higher than 14%. And the problem that the Conservatives have had for many, many years is that they can't even get folk on board with people who should be instinctively supportive of them because the Scottish Tories haven't had a lot to say.
Well, that brings me neatly on to the next question, actually, although in some ways it also preempts it, which is a question from Jonny Gray, not the Scottish rugby player, but the Conservative candidate in Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy at the recent general election, who asks...
Is he still alive?
well, he was at the time of submitting this question.
He must be able to run the 100 in under 10 seconds.
Well, I mean, I think he can name most of the people who voted for him. Yes, but you know. But
thank you for your question, sir. We're only teasing.
He notes that being anti-SNP is no longer enough, given the way the national question has unfolded to the SNP's disadvantage in the recent weeks and months. So he then asks, can Scotland ever be a pro-business, high-growth, low-tax polity with good public services?
The answer is yes, if people vote for it, and the answer is yes, if a political party put before the electorate credible plans in order to achieve this. I come back to my point. I remember once, many years ago, writing an article which Brian Menteith used to quote from time to time, and the opening sentence was, "What are the Scottish Conservatives for?" Because it never really struck me that in the devolved era they had worked out what they were for.
Well, what are they trying to conserve?
Or what are they trying to conserve? I mean, if we look at the 25 years of devolution, from a left-wing perspective, and I suppose my politics veers centre-left, but from a sort of left-wing perspective, you would have to say that on key questions, this city that we're sitting in, the intergenerational nature of poverty, particularly in the peripheral housing schemes, hasn't really changed over that 25 years. There are still large
that's
bits.
an argument that devolution has failed to deliver what it promised to.
Absolutely. Of course it is. Of course it is. And it's parties of the centre-left that have been running this. Now, the issue, I think, for those who are on the centre-right of politics, if their analysis is that parties of the left have failed to make Scotland more competitive, failed to deal with all of this poverty, failed to deal with disadvantage, have failed to reshape a state which is consistent with delivering economic growth, but also providing a safety net for citizens who are in a difficult position. They have to have a series of policies for doing this. And I think the problem for the Tories in the devolved era is that they have been part of the consensus. They haven't been standing out with the consensus. I'll give you one prediction. Had Michael Forsyth, for example, gone to the Scottish Parliament, and had Michael Forsyth...
splendid thought.
And had Michael Forsyth, being the Scottish Conservative leader in the Scottish Parliament, the shape and content of the Conservative offer in Scotland would have been radically different from politicians, no matter how well-meaning they are. Folk like Annabel Goldie and Ruth Davidson, both excellent people to deal with if you're a journalist, and very warm on a personal level and all of this, nevertheless didn't have a lot of ideas. And when the Conservative Party eventually had some sort of mini revival post-2014, it wasn't as a result of any thought process, it wasn't as a result of a great strategy, it was because a lot of hardline unionist voters gave them a dividend after 2014. Their revival came in spite of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, of course, that the Tories spent the first dozen years of the Scottish Parliament's existence effectively apologising for their own existence, saying we were sorry, we're sorry, we're sorry we opposed the creation of the Parliament, we are sorry we opposed devolution, we are sorry really for existing. And as a result of that, they sort of shrunk away from any kind of ideas, any kind of ideological engagement with the centre-left dominance of the consensus at Holyrood. And I think one of the things that is quite interesting right now is that you see, there are people on the left who actually understand that it is good to have a strong party of the right as well, because it's that kind of exchange of ideas, that battle of ideas that creates the conditions for moving forward. And the kind of mushy consensus that we've had at Holyrood over the last 25 years has conspired against that kind of clash of ideas. And so you now have Anas Sarwar saying, well, look, the Scottish Parliament has done a lot of good things on social policy and over the last 25 years. Now, whether you agree whether those are good things or not is not the point, But his point is that we have focused almost exclusively on cuddly social issues at the expense of economic issues. The question of rigorous economic growth, which is essential for paying for the public services that people want, has not been at the forefront of Scottish political debate. Indeed, the if you look at the SNP, it's a catch-all national party. It's a party that aspires to represent the interests of, oil entrepreneurs in the northeast of Scotland and social workers in Lanarkshire. Now, that is fine as a national movement, but when it comes to the sort of ideological clarity that you might want from a governing party, it causes certain problems. And we've seen that in the SNP over the last couple of years. The coalition with the Green Party, very unpopular with a number of SNP MSPs, particularly those from, Perthshire and parts north, because the Green Party is explicitly against economic growth, and the SNP is notionally, at least explicitly, in favour of economic growth. And so there is a tension at the heart of the Scottish Government in those coalition years that I think caused the SNP significant difficulties. But also the SNP's catch-all nature, its belief that it can be a party for everyone, does squeeze out some of the left-right divide that would otherwise exist in Scottish politics, and that would actually clarify some of these issues, particularly when it comes to economic concerns.
Just going back to some of the observations that have been made on previous podcasts and individuals writing in with questions. Wings Over Scotland.
Great fan of the show.
Yes. Observed of the Stuart MacDonald interview. he'll be Labour by Christmas. Let me give you a firm prediction. He won't be Labour by Christmas.
No, it'll be Easter.
From Twitter, Gordon Innes asks if Labour can become the largest party at Holyrood with 35% of the vote. Well, I think the answer to that question is that they can, because of the proportional voting system that we have. I mean, if we look at the percentage share of the vote for the parties at the Westminster election, if they were transferred into a Holyrood context, then Labour would be the largest party. Interestingly, though, that although the Scottish National Party had a terrible night on the 4th, all the way down to 9 MPs, they did poll 30% of the vote. So if they poll 30% of the vote in 2026, they're going to have broadly 30% of the seats. So the direct answer to the question is yes, Labour can be the largest party in 35%. I think one of the interesting issues is that if we look at the times when no one party has had an overall majority, the first two parliaments we had Labour in coalition with the Liberal Democrats in the first Holyrood Parliament, and then again in the second Holyrood Parliament. Labour went into coalition with the Liberal Democrats after 1999. I think they were on 39% of the vote at that time. So Labour plus the Liberal Democrats got you to the magic figure of 65, which gives you the bare majority in a 129 seat Parliament. Then, of course, the SNP went into a minority administration, preferred this confidence and supply arrangement.
With the Tories.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, something, it's important to remind people of that and so on, that Alex Salmond's first government and so on was depended on Conservative support to pass its budgets, which is something that the SNP don't like you to remember, and something that quite a lot of Tories don't like to remember either.
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things is to simply, if we're going to get a very messy election where Labour are on 35 and the SNP are on 30%, will you get to the magic number of 65 as a result of a coalition between two parties? Because it raises the possibility that Labour plus the Liberal Democrats doesn't get you to 65 next time around, and it could be really a rainbow parliament where you have a minority administration which is a coalition which is still looking for a confidence supply arrangement with another party who may well have 5, 6, 7 members.
Oh, I think that's quite possibly the most likely outcome. I mean, I think the other thing to be said is that Labour doesn't have to be the largest party to be in a position to form a government, because the First Minister is elected by MSPs, not by the public at large. If we go back to 2007, I think the SNP won 47 seats in that contest, and Labour won 46. Now, Alex Salmond flew in his helicopter to Prestonfield House and declared victory and asserted his right to form an administration. But there is nothing in the rules that said that had to happen.
Sure.
The Labour Party could have continued. The Labour Party could have said, with Liberal support, no, we want to form an administration and we don't believe the Conservatives are going to vote for the SNP to be in power. Labour could have held on. They chose not to. They agreed with Salmond's assertion in some ways, and I think this was indicative of the way in which, after 8 years in government, Labour had become sort of soft and tired, which is not a great combination for any party, let alone one that wants to actually be in power. And so they knuckled under to Salmond, but they didn't have to. And something similar could happen in 2026. There is no requirement for the largest party the largest party doesn't have the right to get the First Minister. They have the right to nominate someone to be First Minister, certainly. But if somebody, the leader of a smaller party, gets more votes, then that person will become First Minister. And I think it is entirely possible, perhaps even probable, that you will have a situation where Labour and the Lib Dems have more votes than the SNP and Greens, but not enough to command a majority.
Absolutely.
But the Conservatives will be quite happy, I think, in those circumstances to support Anas Sarwar as First Minister, and they will be quite happy to vote for Labour budgets on the basis that, that they're not SNP budgets, but in return for various concessions on matters of Conservative importance. And just as Annabel Goldie was quite happy to support Alex Salmond and vote for Alex Salmond's budgets 2007 to 2011. And so we could be back into that kind of situation where, yes, Labour are in office, but overall there is no overall control.
Jonny Gray got in touch with us, and just to sort of summarize.
Or is this a different Jonny Gray? Who knows? Maybe this is the rugby player.
Does the media make too much of the idea that support for independence is around 50% simply by excluding the don't knows? He says the reality is only 41 or 42% in recent polls are keen and positive about independence. Well, I suppose that if you're sort of taking into account the don't knows, I mean, the turnout at what was the turnout in 2014? 85%?
83%?
83%. Yeah. So even in that political hothouse back in 2014, some 18% of the Scottish electorate did not vote. And of course, at the general election that we've just had, turnout sort of limped to just about 60%. The biggest section of people in terms of their views on the country was We Could Not Care Less Party, because 40% didn't vote, 35% voted for the Labour Party, but 40% couldn't bring themselves to go and cast a ballot. So in any general election situation, in any constitutional referendum, there will always be a section of the voting public who are simply not engaged with it. The way the system works, you have to come to your conclusions on the basis of those who exercise their civic duty and go out and vote. And, the polls are still showing that it is pretty even between supporters of the Union and supporters for the independence cause. We've talked about this many times in this podcast, that there is a credibility deficit as it approaches as it applies to the SNP, where support for the SNP is now well behind support for independence. But then again, that is a challenge for them to deal with that credibility gap. What we also know from some of the polling evidence is that although people are still pretty firm in their view that a vote for independence is the right constitutional option for the country, they do not believe that this is an immediate priority. And this is, I suspect, Alec, where the SNP, when they're discussing in the coming months just what they do with the constitutional question, is a real difficulty for them. It's not that they don't have support for independence out there. They know that they have a lot of support, but if they try and turn the election in 2026, or they try and pose this election or place it through the prism of the Constitution, and even people who support them on the constitutional endgame nevertheless do not think it is the number one issue in that election, they run the risk of antagonising their own supporters. And of course, with a lot of reaction to the Stuart MacDonald podcast, some people think that it was the most honest interview they've seen with a nationalist politician.
Well, it had the best interviewers, certainly.
Of course. They're very, very positive about it. I think it's true to say that a lot of people on the independent side of the argument absolutely hated it. But good. Therein lies, I think, the issue, does it not? That when they come to debate this in the coming months, there will not, in my view, be one overwhelming consensus in the party. There will be a division of opinion.
Yeah, look, again, you can't force people to think the way you want them to. Fundamentally, independence is not as salient an issue now as it has been for much of the last 12, 15 years. and you have to wait for the public to come back to you. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of independent supporters struggle to deal with, because they are, understandably, from their own position and so on, impatient for change, impatient for independence. And they also believe it is a historical inevitability, which I think is a profoundly mistaken view. Yes, it's true that if you look at opinion poll figures, you find that people under 30, even people under 40, are heavily in favour of independence right now as a hypothetical proposition. Whether they would remain so in the event of a detailed prospectus for independence, well, we don't know, and we won't know anytime soon, because there isn't going to be an independence referendum in this Parliament, and possibly not in the one after it either. And it's very difficult for the SNP to force the issue unless the people wish it to be forced. Time and time again, I find myself agreeing with Nicola Sturgeon, the Nicola Sturgeon of 2015, that is, which is that, the only grounds for reopening the national question are when it is clearly the settled will of the Scottish people that the question be asked again. And what did that mean? Well, she said herself at that time, it means support for independence around 60% in the opinion polls for a prolonged period of time, at which point a referendum probably becomes one to determine the scale by which people want independence rather than to discover if they want independence. I agree with Nicola, but the Nicola of 2015, not the Nicola who marched her troops up the Independence Hill time and time again over the ensuing years, only to march them back down again, and in the end leading them absolutely nowhere. So I think, so long as support for independence remains between 40 and 45%, or even 40 and 48%, 50%, it remains a live possibility, but it isn't necessarily going to move anywhere. It's only if you have support for independence well above 50% for a prolonged period of time that I think you would have any kind of real movement on the national question.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of de facto referendums are effectively dead. And I suspect that the SNP will not go into the Holyrood election in 2026 on the de facto referendum. Where I think that they ought to concentrate, and this is my sort of view as a political observer, is simply to make the point that they have had several mandates before when they have pledged such a referendum, but of course Westminster has said no, and the Supreme Court has already, in a sense, upheld the constitutional inevitable, which we all understood, which was that in a reserved issue and changing the constitutional status of the United Kingdom, it doesn't become more reserved than that. The Supreme Court have made the point that an attempt by the Scottish Parliament to hold such a referendum would be an attempt to introduce legislation which is ultra-vires. The Parliament does not have the constitutional authority to hold and stage such a referendum. The much more fundamental question, which I think the SNP should concentrate on, is a basic issue of democracy, and it is to ask a simple question and to have a simple question answered. What are the circumstances in which the Parliament can call a referendum? Is the situation that we had in 1999, the constitutional settlement, fit for purpose? Because it does not strike to me to be remotely democratic that one Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, constitutionally can forever imprison a devolved legislature when a party wins an election on a clear mandate in order to pursue that. There is a world of difference between saying independence is a good idea, but nevertheless, even if you think it's a bad idea, many people will think, nevertheless, you have the right to choose, and therefore the circumstances are, when should you have the right to choose?
You have the right to choose, I would suggest, Bernard, but you do not necessarily always have the right to choose at any and every moment that one political party demands it. If you look at the United Kingdom...
There should therefore be a mechanism which is agreed between both parliaments, which is clearly understood. It gets round this point of never-endums. Of course, if you lose a constitutional referendum in 1 year, coming back the following year or the year after
but that is current SNP policy. Is that if you ask the leaders of the SNP, if there were a second independence referendum and you lost it again, would you accept that result, or would you continue to think that we should have a third referendum? And they cannot answer that honestly, or they duck the question because their actual answer is, well, no, of course we should have a third referendum. Look.
So on the basic question, how do you get to it?
Well, I think you do it the way that, there's been a process. You have an agreed referendum when all parties agree it is reasonable and acceptable to put the question, which was what, after all, happened in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. There is a consensus then. The United Kingdom is really unusual amongst advanced democracies in having mechanisms.
Consensus. What there is a veto.
No, it's not a veto. If there is a veto, it's a veto that is imposed by the people of Scotland, who have made it quite clear they don't actually want a referendum.
It is a veto which is imposed by the constitutional settlement.
But let me finish, please.
The constitutional settlement is such that you need the authority of the Westminster Parliament to
you
hold
need the agreement, not the authority.
You need the agreement. You need the agreement, and in the absence of such agreement, that effectively amounts to a veto.
No, it doesn't, because, let's go back to first principles and so on. If you are a secessionist movement in any other Western European democracy, or indeed Western democracy full stop, there are no means by which you can constitutionally advance your case for the peaceful dismemberment of the nation state. Good luck in Spain, in France, in Germany, in the United States, even in Canada now. There is just no way you can do it. The United Kingdom grants unusual levels of tolerance, indeed some would say indulgence towards separatist movements, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland, where there is a mechanism for in which a referendum
why is
can be
there
held.
a mechanism there?
Well, I'm quite happy to copy the Northern Irish example, if you like, and so on, and say that, yes, the Secretary of State can decide whether there's to be a referendum or not. Now, I've mentioned this to SNP supporters and SNP politicians in the past and said, by all means emulate the Northern Irish example. Ask Alistair Jack as was, or ask Ian Murray now, if the conditions for a referendum to be held have been met. And the answer is, well, no, they haven't. And they haven't been met in Northern Ireland. But if you were to transpose the Northern Ireland example to Scotland, then yes, you can have a referendum, but only if the Secretary of State is satisfied it is likely to lead to a change in constitutional outcome. So even by those provisions and so on, there are absolutely no grounds at present for having a second independence referendum in Scotland. This notion that winning an election at Holyrood necessarily constitutes a mandate for a second referendum. Well, yes, on one level, sure, I can understand why people of an SNP persuasion think that and claim that. But this would be a referendum imposed on an awful lot of people who do not want it. Whereas, in 2011, when the SNP won their majority in Holyrood, there was a widespread acceptance from people across Scotland that, yes, it was reasonable to have a referendum. It was reasonable to put the question, partly because it hadn't been put before, and partly because people, as a result of that, accepted the SNP's mandate to do it. But the mandate for a first referendum is clearly, I think, very different from the mandate for a second referendum when you're wanting to re-ask the same question simply because you didn't like the answer given in the first one. And that is the problem that the SNP have, is that they haven't actually persuaded people that there really are compelling grounds for a second referendum.
Okay, you have a look and see if there's another question, because we're not going to agree on this.
No, but that's okay. We don't have to agree on everything.
Well, we don't have to agree on everything.
This is not Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell.
I simply come back to the point that there is a basic question about whether or not the Scotland Act is fit for purpose. I do not believe on the issue of how a devolved legislature takes forward a constitutional proposal, in this case for independence, that because it takes two to tango, and it does take two to tango, if one doesn't tango, and Westminster has made it perfectly clear it will not tango, the decision not to tango therefore amounts to a constitutional veto, despite the fact a political party has put a prospectus before the country, has won a very, very significant mandate for it. And in the context of 2015, 56 out of 59 seats.
But that was on an election where the SNP explicitly said this is not a vote for independence.
Let me finish my argument. The Conservatives go ahead with a hard Brexit, with a percentage share of the vote which is smaller than that which was being gathered by the SNP. And they go ahead with that. Fine. Those are the rules. You have if you can form a government, if you have a manifesto where you've made a commitment, you have a mandate in order to take that forward. The issue is, and therefore I think that rather than concentrate on the issue of the substantive point of independence, what the SNP may well be able to unite around in the coming months is to mount a campaign which is simply to ask people, are you happy with a constitutional settlement, which means that even if the SNP win a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament on a clear prospectus, as a result of the votes of people in Scotland, it is unable to take it forward because the Westminster Parliament has said no, because the current system, however you describe it, effectively amounts to a veto.
But these things are all contingent on public opinion and actually because I speak to conservative politicians and Labour politicians and so on, and they say quite honestly, quite openly, they don't approve of independence. They oppose the second referendum, but they will say if it is obvious that 65% of people demand a referendum, then the situation changes, and there is no UK government that would
my
not.
Only point is
You
have to write this into a settlement in order that this
is Britain. We don't write things down.
Well, you have to write it into a settlement, and it has to be clearly understood under which circumstances it is permissible for the Scottish Government to hold such a referendum.
But it can never be permissible for one part of a state to have a unilateral right to hold a referendum on secession, without the approval of the national parliament. No. But
you can agree a constitutional mechanism.
The dismemberment
part of the Scotland Act. It's perfectly straightforward.
No, but the dismemberment of the United Kingdom is clearly, and the law agrees with me here, happily. It's clearly a reserved matter.
The law agrees with you because that's the settlement. My point to you is that
there should be a different settlement.
The settlement is not fit for purpose. It is clearly not fit for purpose if a political party is capable of winning an election on a commitment to hold a referendum, but it doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so, and I accept that. The issue is whether or not that constitutional provision, as it amounts to strangling a national legislature in terms of its ambition, my view of that is that it is not fit for purpose.
But it's a devolved legislature. It can't,
That is a separate question from whether or not independence is a good or a bad idea.
No, I agree. It's a separate question and so on. But it is clearly unacceptable, I would suggest, for one part of the United Kingdom, a smaller part of the United Kingdom, to say, that we have the unilateral right to decide the outcome for the whole of the United Kingdom. We may return to this issue.
He's in a bad mood. He's not even going to say cheers.
Oh, cheers, Bernard.
Right, we don't. Right. I think on this note of great discord, because we
pleasing
both have
note of discord.
We both have our pints ready here. We should probably wrap it up for today. But do remember, please send us your emails. It's ponsonbymassey@gmail.com. Please do get in touch via X. It's @ponsonbymassey. X is what used to be Twitter. Do give us some suggestions about some of the issues that we should be covering in future episodes. If you are particularly exercised by an issue, do send us an email. Who knows, we might have you on. We're very much in the business of trying to get alternative voices rather than the two old voices that you've been listening to today.
Well, speak for yourself, Bernard.
I am certainly an old voice.
And I'm a middle-aged voice.
He's a middle-aged voice. Thank you once again to the Press Bar who have been hosting us. They're terrific hosts. If you're in Glasgow and you like the black stuff, it's excellent. Do come down for a pint. Do listen to the music. Are you enjoying doing it in the pub?
Oh, it's all right. We should probably think about having some food at some point, but because it's 1 o'clock now.
I'm from Glasgow. I don't do lumpy bits.
Thank you all very much for listening. It's been wonderful speaking with you again, Bernard, as always. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.